So, Chapter 2 is about the founding and the Constitution, which should all be pretty much review after having taken junior history with me last year. So, the roots of the Revolution really come down to salutary neglect, which, if you remember, was kind of a hands-off approach to the colonies. And then, after the end of the French and Indian War in 1763, two things: the Proclamation of 1763 and an increase of new taxes led to the colonists getting really upset at their government. Lower class folks were looking to be able to settle the frontier, which the proclamation was going to not allow, and wealthier merchants were not big fans of paying taxes. You can see the land that had been gained predominantly in the Ohio River Valley, fighting the French and Indian War, and this was land that the lower classes really, really wanted to settle. The conflict eventually turns into a violent conflict when Lexington and Concord takes place. At this march, you have the British wanting to seize weapons that had been gradually accumulated by the colonists in preparation for violent conflict. And this is where the proverbial poop hits the proverbial fan. This political cartoon is something that I like to use when I'm teaching the sectionalism and Civil War period of time as well. And this really is the day, the moment that led to the actual fighting of the Revolution. After the fighting of the Revolution, folks that are not big fans of government power draft the Articles of Confederation, which gives most of the power to the states, and even the bit of power that this unicameral one-house Continental Congress legislature even had. It was hardly any power at all, because anything they wanted to do required a two-thirds majority vote. So really, this is a dysfunctional system. The glaring example of this dysfunctional system is when farmers that are in debt start to rebel around the country. The most famous example is a rebellion in Massachusetts led by a man named Daniel Shays. This really came close to seizing a militia arsenal in Springfield, Massachusetts, and therefore the possible capability of marching on the Massachusetts state government. This really scared leadership of the time, that the national government really had no way of stopping this rebellion due to a lack of funds for a standing army, due to the fact that they could not tax. So the Constitutional Convention is called. You can see some depictions of Daniel Shays on the bottom left, he and his followers in both photos on top, and then of course the famous painting of the Constitutional Convention on the bottom right. The debates at the convention are largely about who is going to be represented and how. Large states like Virginia wanted proportional representation that would allow their larger population to have more power in the government, whereas New Jersey said, no way, like, you're just going to run the show if that's the case. So they favored equal representation, and you could see the census figures of the time and how much drastically larger than New Jersey, Virginia was. And there were even some states like Rhode Island and Delaware, for example, that were even smaller than New Jersey and would have been concerned with a proportional system. Neither side could really reach an agreement, so James Madison of Virginia comes up with this idea, but he needs to ask Roger Sherman of Connecticut to propose the idea, because the fact that James Madison is a man of Virginia would lead some of these small state representatives to believe that he was doing something tricky. So with someone from a smaller state like Connecticut proposing the bicameral two-house legislature that we now know of, one house, the House of Representatives, would use proportional representation. The other house, the Senate, would use equal representation, and any bill that would become law would have to pass through both houses of the legislature. Here's the structure of our Congress today. When you hear someone using the term Congress, they are referring to the entire body, including members of the House. You will often refer to this part of the bicameral legislature as just the House or the Senate. We have 435 members in the House today. Representation changes after every census every 10 years. And then right now we have 100 members of the Senate, representing 2 per state. Checks and balances was thought of at the Constitutional Convention. They already knew that they wanted a pretty reliable separation of powers among 3 branches. Even within Congress, obviously, they divided that into bicameral branches. But the more difficult part than separation of powers is deciding who is going to get what power in order to provide for a system of checks and balances. Article 1 really focuses on the legislative branch. It describes the necessary and proper clause, the elastic clause, which is kind of what gives us the flexibility to do a lot of things as history goes forward that might not have been made possible had the elastic clause not been included. All of these specifically listed powers other than the elastic clause are referred to as enumerated powers. So some of the specific things listed were that Congress is not allowed to tax exports, they could not grant titles of nobility, they could not favor one state over another, and they could not suspend the writ of habeas corpus without there being a internal rebellion or foreign war going on. Some of the specific powers of Congress, all funding would have to originate in the House of Representatives, and this was so that people would have the most direct influence over what was being spent. Coinage of money is also up to the Congress. The reason it was very specifically the House was in 1787, they designed a system by which only the House of Representatives would be directly elected by the people. The Senate was actually going to be people chosen by state legislatures. Declaring war is up to Congress. Passage of laws is up to Congress. Presidential vetoes of bills that they wanted to become law could be overridden with a 2/3 majority vote of both houses of Congress. Treaties with foreign nations would require a 2/3 majority vote of the Senate. Presidential appointments, particularly Supreme Court justices, can be rejected without a simple majority of the Senate. Then you get to the President in Article 2 of the Constitution. The President enforces the laws passed by Congress, but a presidential action can be declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. They are the commander-in-chief, so they're in charge of all land and naval forces. This ends up, due to the Vietnam War controversy, being limited a little bit by the War Powers Act of 1973. The president negotiates trade agreements and peace agreements with foreign nations, but the check and the balance again is that they must be approved by Congress. Inform people of the condition of the nation, which we know of as the State of the Union Address, and then appoints court justices and members of the cabinet, which must be approved by Congress. make note, the presidential cabinet was not something that was written into the Constitution, but nonetheless, because the president is choosing cabinet members in the tradition of George Washington, that those members would need to be approved by Congress. The judicial branch is outlined in Article 3, which is actually rather vague. The only thing that it really specifies is that there would be a Supreme Court, that justices on that court would serve for life in good behavior, and that does mean that a justice could be impeached if he or she had committed a crime. The Federal Judiciary Act of 1789 is what really defines the court as we know it. The original system not only established the Supreme Court, but also the lower federal courts like district courts. There was one for each state. There's also 3 appeals courts for each region of the country at the time: New England, Middle States, and Southern States. Now, as the country has grown, so have the number of courts. With our population as big as it is, there are 94 district courts, so more than one per state. And there are 13 circuit courts of appeals, as opposed to the original 3. Now, there are 2 ways the Supreme Court hears cases. One is original jurisdiction. This, for the most part, belongs to lower courts who originally hear a case. The only time when the Supreme Court has original jurisdiction is a case involving an ambassador or a case involving a dispute between 2 states. All other circumstances, the Supreme Court has appellate jurisdiction, which are the higher courts, especially the Supreme Court, that hear cases on appeal from lower courts. You can see here a depiction of the appeals process. This is how the Supreme Court hears an overwhelming majority of its cases. The establishing of judicial review is probably one of the most important concepts in junior year U.S. history. It is established in the Marbury v. Madison decision. You don't really need to know the full story of Marbury v. Madison, but essentially William Marbury had been an appointee to the judgeship of a federal court bench. He had been appointed by President John Adams, but President Thomas Jefferson blocked that appointment. He told his Secretary of State at the time, James Madison, to block the appointment. It spends a couple of years in the court system. It makes its way to the Supreme Court. Essentially, William Marbury was saying, you can't do that. I was appointed. Because he was never confirmed by Congress until after Thomas Jefferson had already become president, he said, please do not vote on this. I would rather have someone else, which they said at the Supreme Court was an acceptable move by Thomas Jefferson. But what the case is really known for is the establishing of judicial review. So this case really is what establishes this concept that it is the power of the court to interpret the law. You had follow-up cases by the John Marshall-led Supreme Court. One, McCulloch v. Maryland, which clarified federal supremacy when the state of Maryland tried to tax the national bank. The Supreme Court essentially said, according to federal supremacy, you cannot do that. Another case, Gibbons v. Ogden. A man by the name of Ogden had been given exclusive trading rights by the state of New York on the Hudson River, and a man by the name of Gibbons was like, that's not fair, you can't do that. So, Gibbons sues Ogden. It goes all the way through the federal court system. Gibbons wins. And the basis of this argument in the Supreme Court is that because the Hudson River is an interstate waterway, it services both the states of New York and New Jersey, that the state of New York had no jurisdiction to make those kinds of deals, and that this interstate waterway was only able to be regulated by the federal government using the Interstate Commerce Clause of the Constitution. So the John Marshall Court, John Marshall was the Chief Justice. The Marshall Court is really, really, really famous historically, not only because it was one of the earliest courts and some of the earliest famous decisions, but it clarified so much about people's interpretations of the Constitution. Federalism versus federal supremacy. This is another set of terms that can be easily confused, much like separation of powers and checks and balances, but they do have very different meanings. The Federal Supremacy Clause in Article 6 says that all laws and treaties signed by the federal government are the supreme law of the land and are to be considered superior to any state law. That would, of course, not include things that were left up to the states according to the Bill of Rights, which we will come back to. Federalism, on the other hand, is the relationship between the state and federal governments, which there are enumerated powers of the federal government, but also reserved powers of the state governments established through the 9th and 10th Amendments in the Bill of Rights, which again we will come back to. There is an amendment process included in the Constitution, which required a 2/3 majority vote of both houses of Congress and approval of 3/4 of the state legislatures in order to be added to the Constitution. It is so rare that in more than 200 years of the United States, only 27 amendments have ever been approved, and the Bill of Rights, which was ratified in 1791, is the first 10 amendments. So really, it is only 17 amendments that have been approved in well over 200 years, because the first 10 were added almost immediately. The Bill of Rights includes the First Amendment protecting people's freedom of religion, but even more well known, their free speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly. The language is to peaceably assemble. As long as you're not getting violent, you can assemble and protest. And the right to petition, the right to write down your grievances and send them to your government. The Second Amendment, of course, the right to bear arms. Third Amendment, the right against the quartering of troops in private citizens' homes. This isn't so much an issue for us in the modern world, but it was an extremely controversial issue in colonial America prior to independence, so they made sure to include it in the Bill of Rights. The Fourth Amendment, the right against unreasonable search and seizure. The Fifth Amendment, right to know your crime you're accused of, so your habeas corpus rights, that is. Against double jeopardy, so you can't be tried for the same crime more than once. Against self-incrimination, so you can't be forced to speak against yourself in a court of law. And the right to basic due process in the criminal justice system. The Sixth Amendment, your right to a jury trial, your right to confront your accuser's witnesses in court, to gather your own defense witnesses, and the right to an attorney. Again, more court proceedings and due process rights. The Seventh Amendment is the right to a jury trial in lawsuits over a said amount of money. In the original Constitution, I believe it was $20. Obviously, that with inflation has grown significantly since then. The Eighth Amendment, the right against excessive bail or fines and cruel and unusual punishment. It is your Fourth through Eighth Amendment rights that are often referred to as rights of the accused. And that becomes a hot topic during the Civil Rights Movement under what comes to be known as the Warren Court, led by Chief Justice Earl Warren. The Ninth Amendment said that non-enumerated powers are assumed to be state powers. So unless something is specifically enumerated, so specifically listed in the Constitution for the federal government, they do not have that power. The states do. The 10th Amendment further clarifies, says rights not listed are assumed to be state powers, or maybe even the people themselves powers, something that would need to be a ballot referendum, for example. This is the end of the Chapter 2 lecture on the founding and the Constitution. I know it was rather brief and rather fast, but this should all really be review from junior year. If you have any questions, absolutely reach out to me, and I will be seeing you in class.